Welcome to Clean Capacity on Tap, Unlocking the Potential of Turnkey VPPs. My name is Peter Asmus, and I'm the Director of Strategic Marketing here at AutoGrid. During the webinar, if you have any questions, you can enter them into the Q&A box. It's look for the icon at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to bring in some of the relevant questions into the conversation, or we'll just address them at the end during the Q&A. If we run out of time, we can also get back to you with an answer via email. You can also communicate with me and the panelists through the chat window, which will be monitored throughout the webinar. After we wrap, we will share the recording of the webinar, so feel free to forward the recording to other colleagues that might be interested. Well, on today's webinar, we're joined by Clint Davis at Swell Energy and Alex Pratt at AutoGrid, who each bring a wealth of industry experience. I'm going to let you introduce yourselves, but I wanted to note that we're going to start with Clint, that I actually met Clint way back, I guess it sounds like way back now, in 2011 or so, when I was doing my very first report on virtual power plants, while at the time, might even have still been called Pike Research, which became Navigant Research, which became Guidehouse Insights. And Clint at the time was at Vintex. So Clint, why don't you give a little more introduction about yourself?
Thanks, Peter, and glad to be part of this today with you and Alex. So a little bit about my background. I've been working in utilities since I was a teenager through a family business in instrumentation and controls in the water, wastewater, and industrial energy sectors. And after grad school, moved out to California to work on the market redesign and technology upgrade for California ISO. And so since then, spent about 10 years as part of ABB after the acquisition that Peter was referring to, and spent some years at Sunverge, and then most recently at Swell Energy, where I've been for the past 4 years leading the grid services group.
Okay, great. And Alex, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for organizing this. So I always feel a little self-conscious with my professional background, because I don't have all the different angles on the energy industry. I started in the military, then went to grad school, and have been at AutoGrid for about the last 10 years, running a series of different commercial teams here. At some point or other, kind of owning every part of our utility customer lifecycle, whether it's on the pre-sale side or the delivery side. But most recently, in the last 2 years, I've been leading our business unit focused on what we're calling our turnkey virtual power plants. And that is a real deliberate expansion that we took as a company a couple of years ago to move from pure software platform provisioning, which is how we had originally gone to market, to now surrounding that with additional services, program management, recruitment, marketing, et cetera, to provide full turnkey grid services from DER aggregations. AutoGrid's been around for about 12, 13 years now. We are a global company. We work kind of in all things solution, all types of technology solutions for flexibility management on the power grid. And then most recently, last year, we were acquired by Schneider Electric. So that's guiding a lot of kind of how we think about the next chapter of the company, and how we think about these VPPs playing a really central role in our path forward.
Yeah, thanks. So I think before we dive into some of the questions, though, I think let's talk a little bit about why Swell is here, and I guess both Swell and AutoGrid, you could say, are pioneers in this concept of turnkey VPP. So I don't know which one of you might want to just say, how do Swell and AutoGrid work together, or how have we worked together, or you want to shed just a little bit of light on that before we get going?
Yeah, happy to address that a bit. So we've been longtime partners, working in a variety of different kind of collaboration models on this VPP concept. I think we really, Swell is in some cases using our software to jointly bring these VPPs to utility customers. In other cases, we may have very complementary VPP approaches, whether it's we focus on different geographic areas or different asset classes, or have different DER partners that we bring into these projects. So we work together in a number of these projects in different capacities, but bottom line, both actively kind of pushing the frontier of how these virtual power plants are designed, operated, and brought to into our utility partners. But Clint, anything else you'd add? And I would just say that I've worked personally with Clint for several years now, as we kind of scope these projects and design them and implement them.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, just not much to add, except we've I think, as you mentioned, just been partnered for a long time, and both really pushing to move VPPs forward by actually delivering these projects at scale, which I think is really important as well.
Yeah, and we're just using this acronym VPP, and I guess maybe to level set, because maybe some folks here like, well, what is a VPP? So why don't we sort of level set with that? There's different forms of VPPs. I remember, like, back when I first met Clint, if you said VPP in the US, most people thought of demand response, and that's where that's kind of, I think, basically where AutoGrid began. But Alex, why don't you kind of tell us a little bit, what kind of different VPPs are there, and how does the turnkey VPP look a little different than maybe some of the earlier versions of VPPs?
Sure, yeah. I agree with you. I mean, there's definitely been an evolution in the space of kind of how different demand side management solutions have been termed. And there's still probably a good bit of misalignment depending on who you talk to. The way we think about it at AutoGrid, we have a couple different software modules that we provide, and VPP would kind of be the most advanced of those, where you're incorporating demand response, you're incorporating distributed generation such as solar, you're incorporating storage, whether that's batteries or EVs. There may be front of the meter or behind the meter use cases, and then generally on the actual the grid service you're providing, a VPP will often take more of a real-time, maybe trading or balancing angle to it, as opposed to maybe the binary on-off or kind of crude dispatch of traditional demand response programs. And so I think that's kind of the broader definition, right? Like a VPP can be a catch-all for any type of distributed resource aggregation. I think one way that we really try to emphasize, or at least concepts we try to emphasize when we refer to our virtual power plants, is that really thinking of them as a power plant, how they would operate and how they are interacting with the grid as a power plant. So we have an off-taker, like we are providing capacity or energy or ancillary services to some off-taker, which will generally either be a market in a deregulated scenario, or an individual utility that we might contract with bilaterally if that's the service territory. But all of that, I mean, that's kind of a simple way of thinking about it, but you have to think about that whole, everything about aggregating those DERs. There's this whole life cycle of how do you onboard these assets, and that's really I think the difference with the turnkey model of a virtual power plant. We'll talk more about that, but this is the notion that all of this program design and management, customer marketing and recruitment, enrollment, registering, all of the forecasting and quantification of the availability of your assets, and the planning and optimization around them, and the notifications and the dispatch and the M&V, all of that, which maybe previously or historically might have been a burden falling on a utility to have to manage in-house, can be provided as a turnkey service, and that would be how we at least define kind of the turnkey virtual power plant.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And yeah, even the term virtual power plant, I remember I ran into an academic the other day who was saying that term should be abolished and all this stuff. And I was like going, don't tell me that, that term is not going to go away. So, and I don't even remember exactly what his definition is, but it's true that it was used kind of as this idea to help, how can all these small resources, all different types, basically provide the same services as a traditional power plant. Although, as you said, there's different markets, and some parts of the world it might be frequency regulation, it might be other services. We haven't talked about DERMS. That's yet another buzzword out there. I think at AutoGrid we kind of VP DERMS is kind of even the umbrella under which things like VPPs might follow. But I've often said VPPs will be the glue that holds the future decarbonized grid together. So I don't know, let's let Clint let's dive in a little deeper. So how do these VPPs really connect all these different resources and actually deliver both lower cost and cleaner energy services? Sounds too good to be true, but I guess it's happening. So Clint, tell us, how does this happen?
Sure. So as we talked about for distributed resources, we're really talking about those that are providing power generation or load reduction, even potentially storage closer to the source, meaning closer to whether that's a residential home, whether that's a commercial and industrial facility, or even potentially something that's distributed, but perhaps in front of the meter. Which we can kind of get to in a little bit. But the idea is that we can aggregate these resources and be able to turn them into a resource that's available for a number of different types of entities as an off-taker. That could be the distribution utility who's closest to that source there of a distributed resource. And that comes in the form of a couple of different business models, from avoiding or potentially delaying costs associated with upgrading the network, and can also provide emergency relief in those situations as well. And upstream and transmission system, being able to provide also things like deferral on transmission projects, or potentially reducing line losses, as well as providing additional stability support for the grid. And then at a higher generation level, at bulk generation level, being able to provide that resource similar to how other power plants have been offered into wholesale markets and regional operators over the years. And so that really provides a number of value streams to really generate value from these virtual power plants that can then be distributed down from those who are enabling it, all the way down to the end customer. So it's really an opportunity to reduce the cost for all of those entities throughout that value chain, but also to reduce cost for the end consumer or C&I facility, so that everyone can really enjoy the value that's being produced from these resources.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
And one thing I might add on that too, and because I love this visual that's up. One of the things that we like to kind of highlight is how I hate to bring up the Uberization of everything, but like
Right.
Uber recognized that there's a whole bunch of assets sitting out there, cars that were fundamentally underutilized, and they were sitting around when they could have been generating value for their customer, for their owners, and for the broader society. And there's a very similar analogy here, right? This diagram shows that there's going to be some value that customers have already internalized when they purchase and install some asset, but our fundamental hypothesis here is that there's underutilized capacity and underutilized value in almost all of these assets. And battery will probably be an easy example, but really even in just our HVAC or in other on-site appliances and resources that can provide real value to the grid if you can properly design the programs to engage those, and then have the software technology to be able to actually tap into all of them and aggregate them.
Sure. And one thing I wanted to, I guess we didn't make clear in the beginning. So when I first met Clint and was doing my first VPP report, the big difference between then and now is the emergence of batteries as a key resource. Because I remember when VPP started, it was more like batteries were expensive and everyone was trying to create VPPs without batteries. It was kind of like, well, how do you, match the solar with more load kind of management, and that's how you do it. So that's, I guess, one change. There is one question here I might as well weave into the conversation. I'm not sure who could answer this. How do distribution constraints get accounted for in the VPP? This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but someone asked the question. Can either one of you answer that question? How do the distribution constraints get accounted for in a VPP?
Sure. So I can take that one. So a number of different constraints can occur within the distribution system. Some of those that we talked about that can be really valuable for avoiding overloading of a network. But some of those constraints can be really explicitly taken into account in the operation of the virtual power plant. So one of the things to enable that is having a really good understanding of where those resources are within that virtual power plant, and then mapping those to the distribution network. Once that critical step is done, then you can actually understand how those resources relate in terms of their impact on the network and what availability they would have to contribute to that particular area of the network, whether that's a feeder, whether that's a substation upstream from it, and being able to provide that visibility and control at whatever level is required. And then once those distribution constraints are taken into account, then that asset can essentially be used without violating some of those distribution constraints. And then some of the additional use cases associated with that would be things like when outages happen, how to manage those resources at a distribution level to ensure we don't have things like bounce back occur where rushes from the load can create overages on a local level for the distribution. So that requires good coordination with the distribution utility, and for the distribution utility to have that information in the network mapping to really occur. But once that happens, it really does provide an opportunity to integrate that with the virtual power plant to be able to directly take into account those constraints.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to where we want to go. So, we're talking about VPPs. They can be deployed in regulated markets. They can be deployed in deregulated markets. You were just talking kind of about looking at these resources, often at the distribution level, not always, because we also can have front of the meter assets. But how has, and I know Swell, Clint, you've been very active, California, Hawaii, but how does FERC Order 222 change any of this? You were just talking about the distribution constraints. One question I often get is people saying, well, if you're bringing these DERs into wholesale markets, how's that going to work? Because they're at the distribution level and it's going to, somehow there might be conflicts or whatever. But how big of a deal is FERC Order 222 from your perspective? And is that a major opportunity for VPPs?
Yeah, I think it is a major opportunity. I think in that it has provided clarity on the compensation and the organization of things like minimum thresholds of 100 kW for these aggregations, for the ability to operate in those markets. I think that was a level of clarity that was lacking before, and I think in that sense has definitely provided some certainty around how that will be managed. Within the context of each wholesale market, though, there is different implementations of that. And while that does provide certainty, it's the resources still have to operate within the context of the market products and the operations of that particular market. And I think in that way, there are still differences that emerge across those markets, but at least provided, that certainty. And I think the additional thing that provides is additional opportunity for that value, and in terms of revenue stream from a virtual power plant that is operating in the wholesale market. And to hit on your point about how this works with different layers of virtual power plants underneath, There's been some also recent guidance, one in particular in California, that does provide a pathway for operating virtual power plants at a distribution level for some of those projects, such as what we've worked on with some of the IOUs for distribution deferral cases in California. And those are also allowed to participate in the wholesale markets, especially when you're talking about operating them outside of the times in which they're needed for distribution. So it really does provide that additional value, which some is referred to as stacked value, to potentially have that opportunity to operate at multiple levels within this organization of the grid. So I think that has also sort of tied together those two pieces of both, where these resources can provide value and providing, clarity in terms of how they can participate in wholesale markets.
Yeah, I think the reality is that we are going to be more dependent on DERs in general. And so allowing those resources to now play into wholesale markets does make sense. It might make it more complex, but that's why you're going to need advanced software, data analytics, and all this stuff to make it work. So let's get back to Alex. So I said VPPs can operate in regulated markets with regulated utilities. Why would a utility prefer a turnkey VPP as opposed to maybe just buying kind of the under the software under a SaaS kind of arrangement? Why turnkey VPPs?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think there's not a one size fits all answer either. But in general, I like this diagram here of showing kind of what we think of as like kind of almost a supply and demand side of these virtual power plants, and this us as a virtual power plant operator being this market maker in the middle. And when you think about being on the left side of this diagram, being a utility, recognizing that there are all these assets at the edge of the grid, typically kind of out of your visibility behind the meter, that you can't tap into, your options are either you need to build out a super sophisticated team that is going to go and stay on top of all of the technology advancement, contract with each individual vendor, define these programs, operate them internally, lead all of the customer marketing and recruitment, the calculation of incentives and M&V, measurement and verification, and settlements, all that whole kind of life cycle of how you would actually get value out of these assets. Or you look for a third party that can do that and specialize in that, and that's why the turnkey option becomes attractive. That you abstract away all the complexity of each of these individual devices, each of which may have its own physical constraints in terms of when it's available and how it communicates. It may also have its technical constraints around just how you integrate it with it, whether it's an API or open standards. There's all these complexities that need to be navigated to actually make these things operational. And that's why I think that the turnkey model has become more popular recently, because there's this kind of understanding and appreciation that utilities are not necessarily in the best place to be tracking all of the different technology and all of the different changes that are occurring at the edge of the grid. But what utilities are good at is they're good at buying power, and they're good at and there's a very mature established process for that. So if instead of individually procuring the software and the services and the scheduling coordinator services and the hardware contracts and all of this, they can go and they can just say, we'd like to purchase grid services under these terms, and then virtual power plants aligned to those terms. That's I think a pretty attractive option for them.
Sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about deregulated markets. So let's get back to Clint. Clint, what are some of the challenges aggregators have when they're trying to integrate a VPP into a deregulated market?
Well, it's a little bit of both the story of Swell, which I didn't talk much about earlier, but also how we've seen things just evolve most recently. So,
Okay.
one of the reasons of why we've sort of approached building a company with a finance opportunity in terms of being able to offer financial products, as well as development arm of the company, develop these assets, as well as grid services, is that I think within the regulated market realm, where we had started off with very long-term contracts, going all the way back to um, earliest stages of our company, contracting for 10, 15 years, and going out. That was great. It was great. It's great for the utility. They have certainty. They get a return on it, and it provides a very clear case for the consumers as well in terms of what those savings are. And it, for customers, allows them to have long-term revenue opportunities, which can be financed, which is where additionally, we've come into play in order to solve that challenge, and also to make these systems, which can be substantial in cost, especially if we're talking about energy storage, affordable and able to be built into an offer to the customer that is something that's affordable. And so I think as we look at how that plays into regulated markets, also with wholesale markets, tying this all the way back to the prior discussion, really there emerges opportunities that can be shorter term, that do require an ability to understand that value proposition for the end customer. And sometimes it can be large, sometimes it can be an amount that is a good incentive, but different than a long-term value proposition. And I think some of those challenges can be working within those environments within a deregulated market for the ups and downs on the wholesale side, in order to be able to provide a sustainable and competitive offer for the end customer, and finding that balance there to be able to have great participation in that market, but also be able to extend these programs as regular offerings for customers, so that they can really get value out of these resources, whether those be thermostats, electric vehicle storage as well, and be able to benefit from participation in these markets year after year. So I'd say that's something that has been challenges overall that we've had to address, and I think is still emerging in the market, along with the volatility and deregulated markets that create both opportunity and risk for aggregators, that I think we've seen in very just present ways, and ways that have come across in national news as well, when we have situations where we have extreme spikes in prices, and those supply constraints that we've seen California recently, in Texas as well, that again I think really cause the level of analysis and introspection as to how to deal with that volatility long term, within the context of providing, as a solution provider, an offer to the customer that both takes advantage of that value, as well as insulates them from that risk that is exposed in the wholesale market.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned in the US. I also heard Australia, someone saying like the wild west of I forgot, someone was pointing out like in 2 days someone could make X millions or whatever dollars, but lose equally large amounts also within a very short period of time. So when you have these hyper competitive sort of deregulated markets with prices changing every 5 minutes. Now, that's one challenge. Another challenge that people often think of, whether it's deregulated or regulated, is interoperability. So when we hear like, oh yeah, we can just stitch together all these different resources, different manufacturers, it could be load, could be generation, could be storage, it's amazing what artificial intelligence and controls can do, but there still can be interoperability challenges. So Alex, how has AutoGrid kind of tried to deal with that issue, or the industry in general, not just AutoGrid. That's an industry, that's a question for the entire market, VPP market.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I'd maybe address it in two ways. There's the interoperability of all the actual assets that want to participate, and I think that our kind of headline answer for that, our go-to answer for that is always is standards, right? We need to converge on standards that that do allow for more plug and play and interoperability between all these different devices. It's kind of the only way to scalably or to make these solutions really scalable with the amount of kind of technology innovation that we expect in the space to continue. That said, that's just, they're not all the standards are fully built out, and so there does need to be, we've built a huge library of different direct connectors to other proprietary APIs, or using other different kind of standards for integrating into these other assets. So that remains a challenge, and it's something that I think is also reflective of evolving strategies in this space. So there's, I think, a bit of a pendulum swinging back and forth between where there are certain vendors that may want to offer their own kind of siloed single asset offering, and may not want to integrate in, right? There's the classic Apple versus Android, right? Closed ecosystem. We're just going to provide our one single solution. We're not going to integrate into others. Intentionally not going to support standards, and that kind of limits customer choice for those types of vendors. And so I think we had seen that decades ago. There were the likes of the Converge and Cooper systems, these switches that were out in very vendor locked systems that kind of swung back to this more of a open ecosystem. And I think there's a little bit going back now where certain vendors feel like they have sufficient market power to have a closed ecosystem. And so I think that's going to be something that that the utilities will also need to exert pressure and say, we want our customers to have choice across this whole ecosystem. We want to support standards. We need integration, but we're going to need the utilities to be voicing that as well to make that the reality. So that, I think that's an open area. The other piece, just on kind of just integration, is just thinking about like how do these assets actually register and operate in a deregulated market or even in a regulated service territory. And again, with kind of trying to think about these VPP assets akin to traditional generation, you think about a traditional centralized power plant that has to register and provide telemetry into a market and be stacked in kind of a merit order and have a whole bunch of visibility into its operations and its availability and its dispatchability. And we want to provide the same thing on an aggregate level, but it's not practical really to necessarily have or it's definitely not practical to have the same level of telemetry requirements or registration requirements as a traditional centralized generator for every single individual asset in a VPP. And so finding that balance area of what's the appropriate amount of registration burden and operational transparency and visibility that's telemetry that's provided by each individual asset, and how does the market, how does the balancing authority get the visibility and operational kind of reliability that it requires, but in a manageable way. And that's, I don't have a where that line is, but right now it's a bit inconsistent market to market too. And so I think just finding that consistency of how do we integrate these into markets, understanding that as much as we want them to be akin to traditional generation, there are undeniably distribution implications for how they're managed, and that's a real thing that has to be balanced. This slide, though, I think I would just speak to quickly is I think one interesting way to think about how you do try to stack these resources based on different constraints available, and utilizing software and optimization algorithms to adhere to the specific constraints by asset class, but still provide some level of dispatchability based on those constraints and dispatch parameters. So whether that's, realistically understanding that not all assets can dispatch with the same speed, or for the same duration, or for the same total time in a year, all of those things need to be managed and then ultimately provided as a single aggregated availability of the virtual power plant to whoever that off-taker is. And so I think that's a big piece of how we think about making all these devices operate together and ultimately integrate into these markets or into these customers.
Right. I mean, I think I don't know if we use this multi-asset VPPs. The beauty of it is all these DERs have slightly different characteristics. So if you can bundle them together, and this is also where the artificial intelligence comes in and learn their response times and all the things. So over time, the performance will theoretically improve with the help of that. That's sort of the magic, I guess you could say, of virtual power plants.
And also, I would just say, I mean, on that bundling, you can think about the multi-asset VPP having a lot of the same kind of diversification benefits that you might get in a financial portfolio, right? Having a variety of different strengths and weaknesses of the different constituent devices allows the overall aggregation to accommodate different use cases, maybe blend more expensive assets with less expensive, more cost effective, keeping the price more competitive overall, but still providing really valuable services. So, and then just a de-risking so that there's not kind of complete reliance on a single asset class or a single point of failure.
Yeah, no, it diversity, just like you said, in your stock portfolio and your workforce, it's like just diversifying, trying to manage that. So I think we wanted to launch a poll here. So let's see. Nicole, are you going to launch the poll? Oh, here we go. What is the biggest challenge you face in implementing virtual power plants? So we have a poll here. Let's hope that some folks will respond. And while we're waiting for that, I wanted to, there was an audience question about something along the lines of what are some of the largest turnkey VPP projects out there now? I don't know if either one of you want to respond to that while we're waiting for the poll results. I guess either one, Clint, Alex, if you want to point to a specific example of a turnkey VPP.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. I mean, we.
Oops.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Alex.
I was going to say that, so we've got a couple smaller projects that I think would well, I guess I'd point to a couple of things. There's again a lot of different examples of single asset virtual power plants out there, and I think typically they focus on the battery example. We're in the process of implementing our largest virtual power plant in the Pacific Northwest, which will be announced fairly soon. But that would be, I think, that one will really be an excellent case study on kind of all the different types of assets that we can incorporate and the way that we can really operationalize all of those. We also are operating a very large front of the meter virtual power plant in Europe as well, using utility scale batteries. So those are a couple that come to mind off the top of my head, but I would also, Clint may have others he could highlight.
Yeah,
sure. Clint?
So one of the largest that we're working on right now, that's still in the enrollment and deployment phase, but that's past megawatt scale is with um, Hawaii Energy,
Mhm.
so Hawaiian Electric, I should say. So there we are deploying across 3 islands: Oahu, Maui, and Big Island, and we expect around 6,000 residential systems to be a part of that with energy storage. So as Alex was mentioning, those projects do tend to be the big ones in terms of total capacity as well. But we're expecting about 80 megawatts of grid services across capacity build, which is a charging morning product that's offered, and then capacity reduction, which is evening, and then fast frequency response, which is very fast, as the name implies, response that the storage systems can provide to help with frequency deviations on the grid. And so that at this point, in terms of systems that are live, is probably our biggest project to date, and with the largest expectation in terms of megawatts.
All right, great. Well, it looks like folks have stopped responding to the poll. So it looks like the number 43% said regulatory and market barriers are the biggest challenge, followed by integration of diverse behind the meter and front of the meter energy assets with 26%, then scalability and operational efficiency 17%. So that's, I mean, it's true. I mean, one thing about VPPs, which I guess we didn't clarify, is that you need a market structure and compensation schemes in order to make this all work. You can't just create a VPP out of, you need some sort of market structure, unlike, let's say, a microgrid, where ideally you'd still have a market structure, but there are a lot of remote microgrids where there is no grid interconnection. And so it's basically, you're just comparing yourself against a full diesel system. But with a VPP, you do need that. And that's where Clint was sort of saying, we have FERC order 222, but each control area is sort of on a different timeline. There's still some nuanced differences. So it's not like you figure out California, you're going to just be able to go to Texas. The markets are very different, or even New England or PJM. I often hear PJM people say has been around with, a lot of some of the most robust demand response programs in a while, although unlike California, there's also more diesel sort of backing up some of the demand response. So each region has a little bit of difference here. Well, we only got 15 minutes left. We're having too good of a time here. So why don't we, I don't know, we were going to talk, I don't know if Clint, you wanted to address briefly non-wires alternatives, maybe before we go into emerging technologies. Did you want to just touch upon that briefly?
Sure. Yeah, we briefly spoke about some of those opportunities and distribution networks. In particular, Swell's working on a couple of areas with this. I think in terms of what are the opportunities there. One example in New York, working with Con Ed to do a non-wires alternative solution, basically where the goal is to relieve the need to essentially move load from one circuit to another in order to relieve some of the high loads that they're experiencing on the distribution asset there. And so that's really an opportunity to start with the distribution value, provide that aggregation value, and demonstrate that. It is challenging in New York. We've worked for quite some years now to go through the entire process of getting approvals for storage in particular, which is very new for New York. About 5 or 6 years ago, we did a small pilot as well there in my prior work, but now this is a really exciting time where not only introducing storage in New York City, but also contributing to these non-wire alternatives. Similarly, in California, working with Pacific Gas and Electric around these distribution deferral projects, one particular in Northern California, to provide that relief to a particular area on their grid in order to avoid that infrastructure cost. And so really, those opportunities are coming up in numerous areas, numerous states. Those are sort of always there when there's distribution constraints and needs for investment. And I think that's potentially one of the largest growth areas, I would say, for virtual power plants, is to address those transmission and distribution needs on the grid with virtual power plants.
And I would just maybe echo what Clint was saying just regarding California IOUs. I mean, PG&E certainly they have a portfolio of different resources, both and they kind of, it spans this full spectrum from supply side, CAISO registered assets, and then load modifying demand response assets, and they run some in-house and use some third-party aggregators as turnkey options as well. So really kind of considering and exploring all different paths there, and we're working with PG as well on how to kind of consolidate some of that and bring some of that together in an operational way. And then I think similarly extending that to several community choice aggregators that we're working with that are trying to also navigate this decision between whether to aggregate these resources and register them into the market and have them as supply side resources that could qualify for maybe resource adequacy versus just using them as load modifying resources that would have less of a burden for actually participating and registering in all of the telemetry requirements I mentioned earlier. And then finally, just to round out some of the California work we're doing, we're working with Swell in the SCE territory, and that also has direct distribution value streams associated with it in some of the projects we're doing there. Yeah, anyways, just other examples of kind of, I think California remains a really interesting and dynamic, vibrant place for the VPPs.
Sure. And both what Clint also is saying, I guess it gets back to the original point Alex made about these assets out there have been paid for, but often underutilized. And so when you compare that against all the money that would have to go into a transmission system, sort of the non-wires alternatives, one mechanism to say, well, we could do alternatives. There's all these DRs here. If we put them into a VPP or a microgrid or whatever, you might get similar services, even better services in some ways than some of the traditional solutions. I'm going to address one quick question because it's a very quick response. In a nutshell, how would you describe the difference in value between a VPP and a whole lot of DERs? So I guess I would say the difference is the VPP is optimizing those DERs for specific purposes, and certain market conditions can solve issues on the distribution level and the wholesale level, whereas a whole bunch of DERs literally would be sort of unorganized. Each one would offer value maybe to each individual site, but the concept of the VPP is to harvest all of those underutilized assets in a certain region or for a certain market or for certain service. So I guess that would be how I would distinguish it. Well, I wanted to touch upon emerging technologies, especially EVs. AutoGrid, we've been doing a lot of stuff on EVs. We did a whole webinar about EVs as a grid resource. There's a bill in California that wants to make EVs bi-directional by a certain date, which would mean those EVs would be ready to be rolled into VPPs. So how does, so I don't know, I'm going to actually let either one of you respond about, work on EVs. Who wants to go first about EVs and VPPs, and how are they, offer kind of some challenges, but what are some of the opportunities involved with that? Who wants to go first?
I can just maybe start at a high level that the opportunity is immense. I mean, we see, you think about every EV, or maybe just to take Tesla as an example, right? Every Tesla is the equivalent of maybe 8 or 9 power walls.
Right.
So when we're talking just about the amount of the resource there, it's immense. And then it also has the ability to provide that storage value in different parts of the grid. So it's mobile and a really large storage asset. I think some of the challenges or some of the opportunities and just kind of the overall considerations include how we are actually talking and managing, integrating with and managing these devices. I mean, initially the approach and the path has always been through the charger, and more now that's turning directly to telematics and integrating directly to the vehicle in different ways. And so that's also relying on the vehicle OEMs to catch up, provide those integration points, and similar to what I was saying earlier, decide their strategy on how to integrate into broader pools and portfolios and aggregations. There's also just a lot of uncertainty. I think we're still, as an industry, building up a corpus of experience and data on charging patterns and how much reduction can be achieved from EV charging in different scenarios and for different purposes, right? So, like, fleet charging is much more predictable. It's regular. You know exactly what is available at any time. Baselining it becomes quite straightforward, and so that's, I think, much more understood and straightforward. But when you talk about charging in the wild, or even charging at home at residences, where people might not charge at the same time every day, they might not have fully predictable patterns, and then they may adjust their behavior based on rates as well. Then it becomes kind of how much is truly dispatchable, and there can be reasonable disagreements on kind of how the best way to baseline that is and how best to quantify it. So I think those are all still kind of active areas of opportunity as we're exploring and building up the scale of these aggregations to really make them into dispatchable resources. And we've got a lot of good movement in that space right now, but I think there's a lot more to come. We're investing really heavily on the EV side.
Yes, and you mentioned the EV telematics. We do have a blog on our website that talks about that, and quite a bit of material on that. So, and you're right. I mean, EVs are first a transportation asset. And I remember when I was still with Guidehouse, I did a white paper with Sadia on our team about focusing on fleet management. That seems to be the best near-term opportunity, because you're right, especially buses. And I know we have a project with Zoom to deal with buses, because they have a firm schedule. So you know when that bus with an even bigger battery is parked, and you know when it's not there. So that's kind of a good way to get going. So there was, well, I don't know if Clint, did you want to mention anything about EVs? We did have one question earlier. Go
just real quick then. I guess just to tag on to Alex, your comment about on residential as it relates to baselining. I do think that's one of the most interesting things with electric vehicles having the potential to have very large impacts on the load of a home. That, of course, also when you're using baseline methodologies, can really alter what that load profile of the home looks like. And so I think there's a real opportunity now to really get going on the telemetry side of things, as well as to incorporate that into baseline methodologies, as well as address some of those shortcomings, because the amount of these electric vehicles that will be deployed are coming soon, and they're coming in very large numbers. And at this point, there hasn't been that many to really alter load in sort of this massive way that we're anticipating. And I think taking care of those issues now is very critical, as these resources will absolutely change load profile of the homes in a big way. And not only utilizing those in virtual power plants as dispatchable assets, but also understanding how they're going to impact how we measure those in various markets, such as California and others that use baselining methodologies that are really based on the meter as a whole of the home. So I think that's a really critical area that needs exploration, and even visiting with market structures and compensation methodologies for demand response.
Yeah, I mean, you're highlighting the fact. I guess the other thing we should point out is this market is evolving in real time. I mean, it's delivering value in real time, but the rules are constantly shifting. Generally, I'd say for the better. So the good news is markets are opening up. FERC Order 222 is just one example, but there's all kinds of examples around the world. We're working on a white paper pointing out that also in terms of storage, like in the Dominican Republic, is requiring a certain amount of storage now with big solar plants and facilities like that. So generally, the trends are favorable to VPPs. Here's one question that came in a while ago that does relate to EVs, so we might as well grab it now. Our utility plans to put $1 billion in our rates for a battery energy storage system. Have you compared a VPP of customer-owned EVs? It says in V to G. I think they meant with V to G, not in rates, compared to the battery energy storage system in rates. I don't know if either one of you can ask that question, but someone asked that question. Would someone like to tackle that or no?
Maybe if
I'm a little unclear what they're asking.
Well, maybe if I'm understanding the question right, it's something around the actual ownership model of the asset. So if a utility has the option of they're going to go and spend money on the actual hardware of batteries to install maybe front of the meter at substations, et cetera, or they can direct that money to a bring your own model, which is typically how we operate with virtual power plants, where the asset is owned by the customer or a third party and is financed to the customer. I mean, I think we're obviously a bit biased, but I mean, the beauty of the bring your own model is that one, the utility is not locked into a particular size and scale of the asset. So again, thinking about it, the virtual power plant compared to some centralized utility-owned model, the ability to kind of not be restricted to a predefined nameplate capacity is pretty valuable, right? The ability to kind of scale up and down based on needs. So that I think is one advantage. The other is that just in terms of how the dollars flow, right? The front of the meter, the centralized path, that's typically going to be, it's going to be built by a developer. So the payments to that entity are going to largely flow to energy companies, financiers, developers, kind of the big industry around project development. The beauty of kind of the distributed model and the virtual power plant model is that your customers become your infrastructure, and when you're paying for these assets, when you're paying incentives to rent that residual capacity, that money is flowing right back into the community. That is, maybe spurring economic activity, creating jobs for local installers and the whole ecosystem around clean energy. Just generally kind of investing in the community and service territory. So I think that's one of the advantages and one of the appeals I think we like to highlight around virtual power plants.
Yes, I just remember we have one more poll if we can put that up. And while we put up the poll, we do have one last question about, is customer service for participants part of the turnkey version of the VPP? So that's a question here. We're almost out of time. But if folks want to respond to emerging technology poll here, let's try to get some responses in before we close out. And I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that question about turnkey VPPs.
Yes, I think generally that concept is that it does include customer support for the systems that are being included as part of that turnkey VPP. I think especially in these still relatively early days, customers do have a lot of questions about how VPPs are working. It's really critical that someone is able to answer those questions, emails and phone calls, and be able to communicate what's going on. Sometimes it has nothing to do with the virtual power plant, some issues that they're experiencing. It's really critical at these early stages to really ensure that what is happening, why it's happening, and to be able to field those questions and concerns from customers. So we definitely see that as part of a turnkey virtual power plant and a critical factor for success and making sure that customer service is excellent and is able to really respond in a timely manner and address some of those sticky issues when they come up in terms of things that a customer may not understand where they're coming from, even if they're outside of the virtual power plant, and be able to help a customer understand what's going on.
Great. Well, we're out of time, so thank you so much for everybody for participating. You can see the poll results here where it's EV infrastructure came in number one with 40%. So thanks so much, Alex and Clint. And we can answer the rest of the questions via email.
Glad to be here. Thank you.